Following program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Welcome to About Money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments, surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared on the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
And it is Saturday, and this station is the answer, so this must be the answer about money. Let's get going and talk about money. So the Seattle Money Show is coming to Seattle in June, the middle of June, so be sure to look for that. I will be speaking and doing 3 or 4 presentations. I just came back not long ago from Orlando. They asked me to do 3 presentations there. I did a presentation. You're going to hear some of that presentation today. I did a presentation 2020 and beyond, predictions of the U.S., China, and the world. You know, as I talked about that, as I laid the groundwork for that, I talked, first of all, the difference between the Standard & Poor's and GDP. But even before that, if you look at the Standard & Poor's from the bottom it hit in 1979 until the top in 2000, you know what the annualized return was? From 1979 to 2000, not every year, but the average annual return during that time was 17%. You know what it's been since 2009 to the end of 2019? 16.3. You know, we've been at Adams Financial Concepts, our accounts have averaged 17.36, which is about a point higher than the S&P 500 with dividends invested. That's not every year. 2 out of 3 years we outperform and 1 year we trail, but that's on a rough rule of thumb kind of thing. But that's where we are. But when you talk about the GDP and the Standard & Poor's 500, they're very different animals. GDP is based, 2/3 is based on consumption in the U.S. or consumption in any other country. The Standard & Poor's, 2/3 of what makes up the Standard & Poor's are manufacturing and service companies. So significant difference there. Secondly, GDP, about 10% of the GDP comes from international trade, but there's companies in the Standard & Poor's 500 are gaining 50% of their sales from overseas. 50% of their sales are coming from international markets. Only half comes from the U.S. So when people talk about looking at the U.S., it's not enough to look at just what's happening in the United States. It's important to look at what's happening overseas. It needs to look beyond our shores. So that's what I did. I talked about that in Orlando, 2020 and beyond, projections of the United States, of China, and the world. In China, of course, a very big factor. Their economy has grown 145-fold since 1970. I've talked about it on the radio show. I talked about it in Orlando. I talked about it at the Seattle Money Show last year. Talked about it at Las Vegas. Talked about what's going on, how did they get there, and what's going on. So I'll be talking more at the Seattle Money Show. And before I do the Seattle Money Show, I've been invited to do three shows in Las Vegas. Seattle, I might be invited to do 4. I don't know if that's because they like what I say or if they can't find anybody else to talk. They say it's because they like what I have to say, but you know how that goes. We'll see. So you're going to hear about my 2020 projections on the show today. You're going to hear some about international investing. And we're going to get going almost right away. This is something that I've talked about, and I've been talking about since 2012. So it's not something new. It's something I believe you have to continue to hear because it's a long-term, mile-high view of what's going on. Oh, by the way, I have a great interviewee today, so you want to hear what he has to say as well? It applies to what's going on today. But let me get started on the first segment. Standard Chartered Bank of the UK, 1,700 branches, 80,000 employees. They did a study that became very famous a few years ago. Actually, they released it in November of 2011. And a lot of people glommed onto it. A lot of people looked at it and said, yeah, it makes a whole lot of sense. They found there were two previous times and a current time in which world GDP grew at a faster rate than average. 3 times. Long periods of time, by the way. The first, and what they called it was the super cycle. You've heard this before if you've been listening to the show. The first super cycle began in 1870, lasted until 1913, 43 years. It was driven by the industrialization of the United States. Yes, during that period of time, we had financial crises. We had a crisis that began in 1874. Some people say 1873, but 1874, there was no bailout. But for 30 years, it was a time very similar to 2008. We were going into that super cycle. The United States was an agricultural country. 50% of the people were employed on the farms. By the time we came out of that super cycle, 20% of the population of the U.S. would be employed on the farms. 80% would be living in the cities, employed by manufacturing business, industrial businesses. A very big transition. And while it was very vicious for our agricultural business, and while unemployment ran during that time, we didn't keep track of it, but it probably ran around 20%. People moved from the farms, they moved into the cities, and they drove the economy. Our GDP grew 5-fold during that time. It grew 5-fold. And the United States, during that time, emerged as a world leader. You know, prior to that time, London was the world's financial capital. And yet, during that super cycle, was a time in which that began to shift and would shift to make the United States the center and of finances. But I want to take you back. There was an issue going back that time that I talked about as well. Because at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1900, there was another huge issue. We talk a lot about climate change today, but they had a big issue back then because the mode of transportation back then was the horse. And there was a horse for every 10 to 20 residents in each city, and the cities were growing. And every horse produced 30 to 50 pounds of manure and 2 pounds of urine every day. When I did the show in Orlando, we actually had a picture of the streets of cities and what they really look like. Now, when you see TV, the streets are all clear and the horses never poop on the ground. You never see any of that. In reality, the streets were full of manure. New York City had piles of manure that were 40 and 50 feet high. There were international congresses that were set up to deal with the issue of manure. Dogs and cats and pigs and actually horses, when they died, they would just drop into the street. Goats and cattle embedded in uncontrolled filth for days and weeks. You can imagine what the smell was like. There were people that earned their living getting paid to shovel a path from one side of the street to the other. Think about that. From one side of the street to the other. It's hard to fathom today. It's hard to fathom when you see TV. But that's what it was like at the beginning of the century. Of course, all that disappeared because of the automobile. So that was during that first super cycle, 1870 to 1913. And think of how things changed during that time. And technology was a big, big driver. We industrialized. Second super cycle was from 1945 to 1970. Lasted 35 years. And it was driven primarily by Europe's reconstruction and by Asian exports. It was during that time, relatively benign business cycles, a growth in wealthy countries like the U.S. and U.K., The Dow went from 150 to 1,000. It was the death of the colonial system, but it was also the beginning of the Cold War. Now, I talk about this time and these super cycles because it's easy to get lost and forget. In 2011, when this came out, 2012, everybody in the industry was talking about it. Began to fade in 2013 or 14. Now everybody's forgotten about it, but think about those super cycles, 40 years and 35 years. I believe we're in a super cycle now. Standard Chartered Bank said we are. Began in 2009 and could last beyond 2030. 2030 is just at 21 years. We saw the previous super cycles of being 35 and 43 years. So we're in a super cycle, and it's being driven by the emerging nations this time. 93% of the world's population is going to be living in those emerging nations. 93% of the world's middle class is going to be living in those nations by 2030. Think about it. 93% of the middle class in those emerging nations. We're coming to a commercial break. Don't go away, because there's an impact of all this. And I keep reminding this every 3 to 4 months so that we don't lose sight like a lot of people have. And when you begin to lose sight, you begin to look at how it ends. Don't go away.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
So I've been talking about the super cycle. If you've been listening to me for any length of time, you know I talk about this about once every 3 to 6 months. It's something to keep in mind, because when you begin to forget about it, as most people have, you begin to think about what's going to happen next. We're going to have downtimes, we're going to have recessions, we're going to have corrections in the market. You know, think about that time between 1982 and 2000, that 18-year time period. We saw the biggest one-day drop ever on October 19th, 1987. We saw recessions. We saw some of those times, but it was a bull market. It actually began in 1979, and it lasted for over 20 years. So as people look at what goes on in bull markets, they think about, is it going to end? And last week I talked about the people that are talking about, who wrote a book. Jerry Robinson wrote a book called Bankruptcy, The End of of America and the American Dollar. You know, I disagree completely with that. I think that people lose sight of what's going on. And when you lose sight, you begin to get worried about what do you need to do. There is coming a time, and I talked about that at the Seattle Money Show, but we have 8 or 10 years and maybe more to prepare for it. But let me come back to the third super cycle, because by 2030, 93% of the world's middle class is going to be living in emerging nations. That's the prediction by Brookings Institute. Sorry about that. So what does that mean? So to understand what's happening worldwide, you have to understand what's happened with poverty. In 1820, 200 years ago, 94% of the world was living in poverty, including the U.S. And poverty is defined by living on an income of $700 a year. Not $700 back then, but $700 per year in today's dollars. That's $1.90 per day. And there's a lot of people that were living that way. 94% of the world's population. That's $19 a month, $228 a year. That's what people lived on. Half the people lived on farms, and so they raised their own food. They made their own shoes sometimes. They were handmade. There was not a left or right. It was just a shoe. It fit either foot. and it wasn't fit to the size of the foot. It was just a shoe. Dinner was chicken stew, dumplings, mashed potatoes, biscuits, and honey. There was no salad. There wasn't much fruit. Life expectancy was 37 years in 1820. It grew to 44 years by 1870. And by 1870, world population had shrunk from 94% to 87%. But that was changing. Think about for Orlando, we had a picture of a medical kit. You see on TV the doctors that are walking around with the black bags. You know what was in those black bags in 1870? Saws and knives for amputation, because that was the biggest issue. A lot of different saw sizes and a lot of different knives. They didn't have needles and syringes and cotton and gauze. They had saws and knives. Think about that. That was the black bag back in 1870. Smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis, yellow fever kept the life expectancy at 44 years of age. People have a hard time imagining living on $1.90 a day. I had a client once who was the plant manager for American Standard, and they built a plant in Tianjin, China. 1,000 employees. They were making ceramic toilets, ceramic bathtubs, ceramic shower stalls. Not a single one of those employees had ever seen a ceramic toilet, had ever seen a ceramic bathtub, or a ceramic shower stall. Today, they're all driving cars. They're all using smartphones. That's what change is going on. But that was change was taking place in the U.S. By 1915, 82% of the world's population was living in poverty. But U.S. labor rates, that was the end of the first supercycle. U.S. labor rates had risen to $1,341 per month, from $228 a year to $1,341 a month, almost $13,000 a year in today's dollars. That's $8 an hour people were living on the average. Shoes were made left and right and factory made. Hand labor had disappeared to the factories. The food was varied, and life expectancy had grown from 44 years to 53. And the U.S. was moving from poverty to middle class. In the U.S., 50% of the population had exited poverty and was living a better life. By 1945, the world was still 73% in poverty. And as they began the second supercycle and beginning to rebuild Europe, still poverty continued on. It wasn't until 1960 that we really began to see the change in poverty levels. That was as we were coming to the end of the second supercycle, and we were seeing a big drop. Today, only 10% of the world's population lives at the poverty line, and that's changing very rapidly. And what happens is when those people, as I mentioned about the factory workers in Tianjin, China, they're buying cars, they're buying smartphones, they're buying lattes, they're buying store-bought clothes and food, they're ordering books, they're beginning to move into consumption from subsistence. It's a big number, but it's declining. And as you go forward and you think about where we are in this whole market time, we have until 2030, maybe we have beyond that time to see a market. John Templeton used to say, bull markets are born on pessimism, they grow on skepticism, they mature on optimism, and they die on euphoria. Think about where we are. We're in a growth or optimistic market. I don't even think we've reached an optimistic time. We're still in a growth phase where people think things can turn down into a great recession or a bankruptcy overnight. Not true. Not true, not true. We're in a super cycle, and I repeat this every 3 to 6 months to keep your focus on it, because when it does end, and I do believe it's going to end. That end is coming in 8 to 10 years, maybe longer. We have time to prepare for it. I was an Eagle Scout, and the motto was, be prepared. That was the motto, and that's what I want my clients to do. That's what I'm doing for my clients, and that's what I hope my radio listeners are doing as well. Be prepared. And you need to be prepared for twice as much as you think you're going to need, because that's the kind of thing that's going to happen. And that's a whole nother program. I've talked about that a number of times. We'll talk about that, but not today. Today I want to finish talking about international, but before I get there, I want to introduce my guest today. My guest is Brad Neer of Rainier Recruiting. Welcome to the program, Brad.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So why don't we start with your background?
My name's Brad. Hi, thanks for having me. I've been an executive recruiter and a recruiter here in the greater Seattle area for about 16 years now. I'm born and raised Seattle. I founded a company called Rainier Recruiting about 4 years ago. That's a boutique agency, and we mostly fill leadership and management positions with local companies.
So let's talk about the recruiting and what you do. Talk about the recruiting process.
Yeah, I lead a team of 10 senior recruiters. Like I said, we're a boutique agency, so we really do a lot of confidential and a lot of hidden market searches for local companies. Since I'm born and raised here, I like working with local businesses, and they contact us when they need various flavors of leadership staff, anybody from a manager to a director to a CFO or a chief marketing officer or something like that. So we represent both the candidates and the employers and try to match up some high quality people.
So suppose I decide that I need a CFO.
Yeah.
What would the process be?
Yeah. The reason that I like to focus on Pacific Northwest is because I almost don't recruit for any company anymore unless I drive over to your office, meet you and meet your whole team and really get a sense of the culture. So that's the beginning of our process, is really making sure we understand our client. If you just send me a job description, I'm just guessing. So I really like to be a high quality of service in that way. We're not just a recruiter on the end of some phone call. We really do start the process with a handshake and an understanding of that company's true culture.
So how do you get down to true culture?
Well, it's meeting that executive team and really trying to understand not just what a job description might say or what kind of people they think they might need to hire, but what the health of their business is. We don't just recruit in any one field. We recruit from manufacturing to software, but the common thread is that they're leadership roles, right? So culture is different at every one of those companies, and sometimes it helps to have a third party kind of come in and get a sense of your culture, because you might think it's one way, and it might not be that way all the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you start with an interview of the company itself.
Yeah. Yeah, we do both. I mean, we have to interview the employer just like we interview the candidates, right? 2020 is an extremely competitive market. So I need not just a job description in order to find you a good employee, but I also need a lot of selling information on why the best man or woman out there should want to talk to your company, because there are no good candidates looking proactively for jobs right now. They really have to go hand select curated lists and go talk to these people live. So it's a tight market.
Okay, we're going to come back right after the commercial break and follow this up more. We started talking about the company in the interview, but there's more to it than that. Don't go away. We've got more to talk about. Stay with me. We'll be back after the commercial break.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I want to drill down more on this in the culture.
Great.
Brad and I go back a ways because at one time, the company he worked for had an office on the same floor as my company was. We were on the 23rd floor of what was Safeco Plaza, maybe still is Safeco Plaza. Now I'm on the 43rd floor, and he's moved to South Lake Union. But going way back then, and I want to drill down on this. You talk to the employer, So we used to see each other fairly often. So you come in, you
Yep.
talk to me, you talk to my team as well.
Yep.
And what are you trying, as you talk to us, what questions are you asking? What are you seeking? What are you...
Well, the questions that a recruiter might ask a hiring manager might be different than what we're really trying to ask. What I'm really trying to ask is, are you a competitive employer? And it's kind of mean to say that directly, right? But what I'm really looking for is, are you paying a competitive wage? Is this a good company to work for? Are people smiling in this office? Or is this even the kind of company that I want to recommend candidates to? So 2020 is extremely competitive. We cannot be representing or recruiting candidates for low market job offers. And if you're an employer and you're hiring people right now, you need to be paying top of market offers if you want to get good people. Because much like housing, right? Employment follows housing a lot. The unemployment rate in the Seattle area is the lowest it's been in 51 years. So, the best candidates are not looking. What I'm really asking employers is, are you prepared to make a great offer if you see a great person?
Okay, so you come away, I've given you some criteria. You see that we're ready to step up to the plate, swing, and hit a home run.
Good. Well, that's when the hard work begins.
So then what happens?
Now we got to go find you a candidate, right? And like I said before, the best men and women are not looking at job boards. We have to hand select curated lists and go find these people. So that's when my recruiting team comes in. I give them a lot of credit because they're the one in the trenches, having hundreds of conversations with candidates monthly. When you work with a recruiter, you're not really interviewing for a job per se, right? Because my team has access to 50 or 60 different positions at a time. What you're really doing is giving that recruiter your wish list. And that's not what you would say in an interview, perhaps, right? When I'm in an interview and I'm interviewing for a manager level position at a software company per se, I'm going to tell them everything they want to hear, right? But I'm going to tell a recruiter something different. I might say, well, I'm sick of commuting over the bridge every day. I feel like I'm not valued, or, you're not going to say those kind of things in an interview, but you'd say them to a recruiter. And you certainly should say them to a recruiter, because then we can help you find a position in a company that better suits what your career wish list is.
So how do you find people to talk to?
Oh, we hunt them down, really. It's a combination of everything. We use all kinds of software tools. We email people. We actually pick up the phone, and we drink a lot of coffee. We have a lot of coffee meetings with candidates, and I think that's something that a lot of the recruiters aren't doing lately. And I think recruiting is a business. It's kind of like being a salesperson in a way, but it's really cyclic. I think these transactional recruiters are really not with the market anymore. Recruiting is about relationships, and it's about active listening. And I don't think a lot of junior recruiters are doing that anymore. So that's a separate conversation, I'm sure. But candidates, they should be looking right now. Much like selling your home in a top of market kind of economy, there are employers out there right now that are paying incredible salaries for talented people. And I think, to your super cycle point, that's going to continue for another many years.
8 to 10 years, maybe longer.
I could get behind that. I think the challenge for a recruiter will be the low inventory of talent available. So if only my cloning machine were a fire up. That brings up a thought, though. I mean, just at the end of last year, at the end of Q4, we doubled an executive's salary in base pay. That person wasn't looking. I'll spare his full name, but his first name's James. We found him through, it was actually an introduction from another executive, and we doubled his base pay. And he wasn't expecting it, but as soon as the offer came in, the employer proactively decided to say, we want to make a splash with this guy. We're going to make him a top of market offer. And they knew what he was making, but they still doubled his pay. That gentleman is extremely happy at the company we placed him at. And I bet you he is anxious to continue to perform and to show those investors what they're getting in him. He's a very talented guy. So that was a fun one.
So, going back a number of years, it was easy to find talent, and really good talent. Yeah, you could post something almost on Craigslist
Yeah,
and
those-
come up with somebody that was good.
Those were the days.
Those days are long gone.
Gone. They're gone. I mean, every good candidate should expect to receive 2 or 3 really high quality job offers right now. So, it doesn't really behoove a recruiter to say it, but maybe you shouldn't take the first offer that you get. You should shop the market a little bit, especially in Seattle. We are surrounded by e-commerce and technology. We're an import-export. We're a port city, so there's a ton of APAC business that happens, and there's just a lot of global business in this area as well, not just in software and technology, like I think a lot of people in Seattle think Seattle is anymore, but I was born and raised here. There are still a lot of great businesses that are family-owned and local that, are in distribution and trade and construction and things like that. So we don't recruit for any one specific industry. We more service the entire Puget Sound, which has been fun because I feel like I've got a finger on the pulse of an entire, regional ecosystem of businesses.
So do you find many people that are able to transition from one industry to another?
More difficult. Yeah, we've done it. If you were in a, industry A and you wanted to pivot into a brand new field altogether, you probably need a recruiter in your corner. Because, it's about the introductions and the relationships that people in your network will have that'll get you in the door at that new industry. So that's a good question. We get it a lot. We don't specialize in it, certainly, because it's a little bit hard to convince an employer to, consider candidates from different industries altogether. But your chances certainly increase if you work with a recruiter because clients usually trust me, right? They've hired people from me before, and if I say, hey, you should consider this candidate over here. They haven't worked for your direct competitor, but they've got a lot of great skills and they'd be hungry and motivated to prove themselves to you. Then that could certainly happen more so than you just applying in cold on your own.
So you have 10 people working for you?
Yep. Or I work for 10 people, depending on how you look at it.
The firm is 10 or 12 people.
We're
and you
11
placed
employees.
a couple hundred people last year?
Yeah, we place a couple hundred every year, and so we're small but mighty. I founded the company 4 years ago because I wanted to give recruiters a stable workplace, and recruiting in general, that quote unquote staffing industry, kind of has a bad name for turnover. When I won the 40 Under 40 award this last year, I talked about that, but it was important to me to give people career stability in recruiting because it's a tremendous industry to work in. So I'm proud to say that my team is among the most stable business in the Northwest in my industry. And we've got a portfolio of customers that are mostly repeat businesses now, which is great.
So someone wants to use you and hire you. How would they get a hold of you?
Oh, well, I'm not hard to find. I'm a recruiter. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Brad Neer. But you can reach out through Rainier Recruiting's website or one of our team can get a hold of us.
And what is the website?
It's rainierrecruiting.com. I designed it. I took almost all the photos on that website too, actually. So,
and the phone number?
206-219-9096 is our main line.
Say it again.
206-219-9096.
And is that just for employers, or if somebody was a candidate and thinking about changing jobs?
Yeah. No, we've got something like 60 or so positions open right now. So we're always interested in talented people. If anybody listening or themselves or knows someone that's looking for a new position, we love talking to talented professionals in the Northwest, and we do also have some bandwidth to bring on some new searches as well. So if you or anybody you know that is hiring, we'd be happy to have that conversation as well.
So great having you on the program.
Thank you. No, it's good to see you again.
I mean, it's important to find the right people for the right job.
Yeah.
There was a book that came out called Good to Great.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they said in the book is you need to look at your people and get the people off the bus who are not performing. Mm-hmm. And it's a difficult time when talent is so difficult to find, but yet it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't thing.
Yeah.
Because if you don't find the right people, you don't do well.
Yeah.
And to find the right people, you have to get rid of the duds.
Yeah, we work on a lot of confidential searches just because of that. An employer doesn't want to, leave, let's say, a sales territory empty, or, fire the payroll manager without having someone else to process the people's paychecks, right? And so they'll use us as a confidential interviewing source so that they could compare candidates and, hopefully identify somebody before they have to make that change.
So give us again the website.
Yeah, it's rainierrecruiting.com, just like the mountain.
And the phone number?
206-219-9096.
So thanks for being on the program. Lots of good information.
Thank you.
And if you're listening to the program and you need really good employees, you should call Rainier. Call Brad. Brad. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. We're coming up to the end of this. Don't go away. We've got a commercial break. And I want to talk about international investing, because one of the things that comes up is if the growth is in the emerging nations, then why shouldn't you invest in those emerging nations? Well, there are reasons not to. Very good reasons not to. But that's coming after the commercial break. Don't go away. I'll be right back after this break.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
So I want to finish up and talk about international investing. I don't do it. And there's a reason why I don't do it, because if you look at the Standard & Poor's 500, 50% of their business comes from overseas. But there's been this whole thing since about 2000 that you have to invest internationally. There was a large brokerage firm, Goldman Sachs, who produced a report in 2001 that said that the place to invest was overseas. They identified 4 countries with exceptional growth prospects: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The BRIC report, the BRIC countries. Those countries had a GDP that was greater than the U.S. and other developed nations. And the thesis is that if you invested in companies in those countries, that you could do better than you would do investing in the U.S. And it sounded reasonable, sounded logical. It seemed to make international investing make sense. That's on the surface. The problem was that when you began to dig into it and dig into the thesis and hypothesis was not backed by actual numbers. I looked at it in detail and decided I'm not going to do this. I was maybe one of the very few, maybe one of the very, very few who said, I think there's a problem. I don't think that's what the numbers show. The BRIC thesis was based on a very limited information, just 10 years in the case of Brazil and Mexico, not much longer in the case of other countries. And if you look back at the 40 years of the United States time, there was a negative relationship between the stock market returns and the GDP. So as I looked at this and I thought, GDP and stock market, they don't move together. Sometimes it's a reverse relationship. That was borne out a couple years later by Credit Suisse, who did a study looking at 83 countries from the period of time of 1972 to 2009. I said a few years later. Well, it was actually 2009, 7 years later. And they ranked the countries by GDP growth for periods of the preceding 5 years. And they looked then at investing in the stock markets. And investing in the highest growth stock markets produced a return of 18.4%. But investing in the lowest growth produced a return of 25%, significantly better than investing in the high growth. And so I think that the BRIC hypothesis, it continues to be talked about. It continues to be talked about a lot. It gets a lot of play, but it was wrong. It's wrong. It was wrong then. It was wrong in 2009. It's wrong today. I started my professional career in the aluminum industry in an aluminum smelter. It was half owned by an American company, American Metal Climax, and half owned by a French company, Péchiney Aluminum. And the process for making aluminum was discovered by two men at the same time, Charles Martin Hall and Paul Héroult. The Hall was an American, Héroult was a Frenchman. Hall's company, of course, became Alcoa. Héroult's company became Péchiney Aluminum. So I was transferred soon after starting to work in the smelter, and I ended up, Péchiney moves people in between research and production all the time. They tried to pick the very top students out of the top universities and put them into production. And so I got introduced to the system in France. You know, children begin school, and I think it's important to understand, children begin school like they do in America, or a year or two about the same age. But at 12, there's a first separation, a test. Those who pass go forward, and those who are on the bottom part of that test end up shifting to trades. And you see kids that are 12 years old sweeping up hair in a salon. You see kids riding on a garbage truck. You see them learning how to change tires on a car. Those are the ones that didn't make it at that point, beyond 12. At 18, there's a second separation, and this is the baccalaureate. And that determines who goes to college, who doesn't go to college, and which college do you go to. The top three colleges in France are Polytechnique, École de Mines, and Chantal. Those students who didn't pass the bac, who aren't going to college, go to work in an aluminum smelter, for example, and they can become a foreman and a general foreman, and then there's a ceiling, and a general foreman never gets promoted beyond that level. That's the maximum they can. Now, if you graduate in the bottom three-quarters of your class from Polytechnique, École de Mines, or Centrale, you parachute in. I graduated in the bottom three-quarters of my class from Carnegie Mellon, and Carnegie Mellon was considered, at that time when I graduated, Time Magazine had picked it as the best business school in the country. I graduated in the bottom three-quarters of my class, so I was like those bottom three-quarters in Polytechnique, École de Mines, and Centrale. I was parachuted in, started as an assistant to the president of the joint venture, started as in production, and I soon became a plant superintendent. That was not an immediate process, but it took a few years to happen. But from that position, you can rise almost to the very top management. But there's another glass ceiling that happens. You can't get past that glass ceiling if you start like I did. Now, if you graduate in the top quarter of your class from Polytechnique, École de Mines, or Centrale, you go to work for the government for 20 years or so. And then after 20 years, you parachute into the very top positions in major companies. So let me bring you back to Péchiney. In the 1980s, the French government decided they were having financial problems to meet their budget, so they decided to nationalize Péchiney, Credit Lyonnais, and some of the others, and take those companies in to generate additional revenues for the French government. Do you think there were any protests? No. Do you think if the U.S. decided it was going to nationalize Apple, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, there might be a little bit of pushback? No, there'd be a lot of pushback, a huge amount of pushback. But in France, no, all these people came together, all these people had worked together, all these people knew each other, they'd gone to school together, they all come together, they're alums of the same school. So Péchiney and Credit Lyonnais are, in fact, nationalized. Shift forward 20 years, and France is again having a budgetary crisis, so what do? They privatized Péchiney. Now, Credit Lyonnais did not work out quite as well. Credit Lyonnais had to file for bankruptcy because the government so ran the company. Péchiney was also not the best condition. They had sold off parts of Péchiney, but they actually privatized it again to raise more money for the government. That's the way it works in international countries, and that's why I don't do any international investing. When the Standard & Poor's companies get 50% of their revenues from overseas, and that's grown from 40% in the last 20 years, you can bet that there is an exposure and a way to benefit from the growth of those emerging nations. And it's going to continue for the next 8 to 10 years. So that's what this program is about. It's a preview of my session coming up at the Seattle Money Show. It's a preview of what I said in Orlando. It's a preview of what I'll be saying in Las Vegas. I keep saying the same thing at all these shows. I mean, you'd think I'd get better and better at it as time goes along. We'll see if that happens. Anyway, now you've had the preview. Do plan on coming to the Seattle Money Show and seeing it. By the way, Salem Radio is going to be one of the sponsors, and they will be at the show, so you can see what goes on at a radio station as well. Well, kind of. It's kind of. Anyway, that wraps it up for today. I will be back next Saturday to talk more, and we've got a lot of things to talk about with what's going on in today's economy. We'll be talking about that more and more as these weeks roll on. Stay with me, come back, join me, because on Saturdays, we have the answer about money.
You've been listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Saturday at noon for more About Money with Mike Adams here on AM 1590. The Answer. The preceding program was sponsored by Adams Financial